Hey folks, Keith here at Chicken Thigh Fishing. Welcome back to another reel cleaning video. In today's reel that we are going to disassemble, clean, lubricate, and reassemble is a LEW's American Hero baitcasting reel. So this reel actually hasn't been used, so it's not going to be dirty. My son bought this reel and he bought it the wrong hand, and we still have it. He's a lefty and he didn't know it at the time because he was just starting out and he bought a righty reel. Turns out he was a lefty. So I have a brand new reel here, so it's not going to be dirty, but we're going to tear it down anyway in case this is a reel you own and you'd like to know how to disassemble, clean, and reassemble it. But before we get started, just a couple of pointers that I always give on my reel cleaning videos, and those are these. I always recommend having a schematic available for your reel. It helps you to be able to see a blown up photograph of the components, especially when you're new to this. And if you get your reel in a box, you should get a schematic of your reel inside the box. But if you don't and you buy it as part of a combo like this reel at a sporting goods store and the reel comes on the rod, you're typically not going to get a schematic. It's easy enough to Google it or visit the manufacturer's website, in this case LEW's, and you will be able to download and print a schematic of your reel. Also, I recommend having your phone handy, and that is so you can take a couple of photographs during the process. That will help you greatly, again, especially when you're new to this and you're not very familiar with the components of a baitcasting reel. There's a few key times during a disassembly that I recommend that you take a photograph, and it can really help you to refer to a photograph that you took when it comes time for reassembly. So I'll point those times out to you. And the last thing is I like to work on a movable work surface. And you'll see here that I use a cookie sheet, and I use a bright colored cloth or a chamois or something to put down so it contrasts the parts well against it so you can see them and you don't have something, blend in and you don't see it because some of the parts are small. It can take you, an hour or more to disassemble and clean and reassemble a reel. So if you're like me and you have kids and grandkids or you have pets or whatever, there's a reason you could get called away. And the last thing you want to do is leave a disassembled reel and all those components on a countertop or on your dining room table or something like that. So if you don't have an area like I do down in the basement where nobody's going to get at it, I recommend working on a movable work surface. That way, if you get called away in the middle of your project and all these parts are all over the place, you can simply put it up out of harm's way somewhere and then resume your project when you come back. So I always recommend a movable work surface. Trust me. All right, so let's get going. And the first thing we are going to do is remove the palm side plate. Now you're going to hear me refer to the palm side of the reel and the handle side of the reel, which should be self-explanatory. The handle side of the reel, which is also the gear side of the reel because the gears are on this side, is the side with your handle. And the palm side is the side that sits in your palm when you hold the reel. So the first thing that we are going to remove is this palm side plate. And now on this American Hero reel, that palm side plate is secured by a spring-loaded rod right here. And this is how you release the spring tension. You put a thumbnail or a fingernail right on this little notch here and you pull against it. And once you have that spring tension released, you can rotate that palm side plate up and then you can remove it. And sometimes the spool comes out with the side plate. If it doesn't, you can just take it out separately. But you have your palm side plate and then you have your spool. Spool just goes in and out like so. Now we're going to turn to the handle side of the reel where we are going to disassemble the handle assembly, the star drag, and the handle side plate. The first thing we are going to do is remove the handle nut retainer screw, which holds in place the handle nut retainer, which secures the handle nut, which is underneath it. So once I have that screw removed, that handle nut retainer should just fall off. If it doesn't fall off, just take a small flathead screwdriver and pop it off and it'll come off easily enough. Next is the handle nut, and for this we are going to need a 10mm wrench, and we're going to go ahead and crack that nut loose. And once we have that crack loose, we're going to go ahead and unscrew it. Now just a word on the handle nut. This is a righty reel, so it's perfectly normal. But if you had a left-handed reel, that is to say the handle is on the left side as you're holding the reel, it's not right tight, left loose, it's reverse. And that's kind of important because if you have a lefty reel and you crank it the wrong way, that nut is usually made out of soft metal and it's pretty easy to strip. So just keep in mind, if your reel is lefty, it's going to be opposite. And so now I'm going to remove that handle, and stuck to the back of the handle is going to be this washer clip. There's always a washer or a clip type washer underneath the handle, and if you don't see it here on top of the star drag, it's because it's stuck to the back of the handle like you just saw there. So you just want to be aware of that in case it's not here and you're handling the handle and it falls off somewhere and you don't know, and all of a sudden there's a component sitting on your tray and you don't know where it came from. So if it's not here, it's going to be stuck to the back of your handle. And so now we're going to remove the star drag, which is simply a matter of unscrewing it. Underneath the star drag, you're going to have a series of washers. We have the first washer here, and underneath that are going to be two spring washers, which are curved washers. And important about these spring washers is you want to keep them in the correct orientation because they have a curve to them. One of them is curved this way and the other one is curved this way. So you want to pay attention to that because you're going to be picking that up to clean it and manipulating. You're going to be changing the position of it. So you want to make sure that you know the correct position and you put it back on correctly when it comes time for reassembly. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the other spring washer. And now underneath the spring washer on the main gear shaft here will be the sleeve or one-way collar. Now sometimes you can tap that out, and this one has a washer on top of it. A lot of them do. So you'll have a washer on top of the sleeve. And sometimes you can pop that sleeve out in this manner. But if you can't, like I can't right now, it doesn't want to come out readily, that's not a big deal because you can take it out very easily when we take off the handle side plate, which is the next step anyway. But the reason I point that out is because if it doesn't come out for you, and then you take off the handle side plate and all of a sudden it falls out, you understand where it came from. So you can try to tap it out ahead of time, and if you can grab it, you can pull that off there. If not, you can do it now when we remove the handle side plate. Now, different from the palm side plate, which you recall had a spring tension mechanism in order to release it, and you rotated it and popped it off. The handle side plate is secured by screws. And on this reel, it's secured by 1, 2, 3 screws on the exterior side of the reel, and 1 screw on the interior side. So I'm going to go ahead and remove those screws, and I'm going to lay them down, but I'm going to be careful to lay them down in the same pattern that I removed them, so I have a visual illustration of which hole they go back in when it comes time for reassembly. The reason for that is a lot of times on bait casting reels, you will have screws of various different lengths, sizes, and diameters, and you don't want to be trying to fit the wrong screw in the wrong hole during reassembly because, you know, you could wreck the plastic that it goes into. So I'll remove those screws and then we'll lay them out. So I have all 4 screws removed now. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that side plate, and you'll see here that the spring tension rod is here, and there's really no need to remove that because you can clean that effectively while it's still attached. And so now that we have that handle side plate removed, we can poke out the sleeve I was talking about. And so this is the sleeve or one-way collar. Now, one thing that's very important about this sleeve is, at first glance, it appears that the two ends of it are identical, but they are not. One end is perfectly circular. The other end has two straight sides to it, kind of like an oblong rectangle shape. That side goes up, and the circular side goes down on the main gear shaft. So you want to be aware of that for when you pick it up and clean it. And when you reassemble, it has to go in that one way. So I'm going to lay down that handle side plate. And I have my screws here, and so I know this screw goes here, this screw goes here, and this screw goes here. And then because this screw is pointed that way, I know that that's the back screw. Now at this juncture, here's where it would be important for you to take a photograph if you're new to this and you're not familiar with the components of a bait casting reel. And so if you mess something up, which really you shouldn't because it's not that complicated, but you know, it happens. So if you take a photograph here and something doesn't look right or feel right when you reassemble the reel, you can refer to that photograph and say, oh, I have that in the wrong location or something like that. So I recommend taking a couple photographs from a couple different angles. First, we are going to go ahead and remove the main gear and the drag washer stack. And I'm going to break it free from the base of the main gear shaft. And when I do, I'm going to reach underneath it and hold it all together like a sandwich. And the reason I'm going to do that is because there are washers on top of this main gear, and there are a couple of components that are stuck to the bottom of it. And so I'm going to lift that off. And since I'm holding it, those parts won't fall and they won't get out of order or anything like that. So underneath here, typically what you're going to have is a ratchet and a carbon fiber washer that are stuck to the bottom. Now they don't always stick to the bottom, but 9 times out of 10 they're going to be stuck there. So if you don't see those two components here, they're going to be at the base of the main gear shaft. So now that I have those off the bottom, I'm going to remove the washers from the top. And I have a metal washer. And I have another washer here made of a different material. It's kind of like a rubber material. And then I have the main gear. So here I will point out to you something very important about the ratchet. You'll notice that the ratchet has teeth on it, and you'll notice that those teeth are going in a clockwise direction. You're going to want to make sure that when it comes time to reassemble, that you put that back on in the same orientation that you took it off, because it's possible to put that on incorrectly with the teeth facing in the opposite direction. And if you do that, your reel is not going to work properly. And I'll give you a little illustration of that here. When you have that ratchet on properly, the job of these teeth is to engage with the kick lever. And you will see, first I'm going to remove these springs because those are going to go flying when I depress the thumb release lever. When you press the thumb release lever, that kick lever is going to engage with the teeth of the ratchet. And you can see how the kick lever stops it. Now, if you put that on in reverse, and have that incorrectly on there, when you put the reel together and you engage that kick lever, you're going to see that it's unable to engage it, and the teeth just go right by it. And so what's going to happen there is when you put the reel together, as soon as you depress that thumb release lever, you're going to know something's wrong, and it's probably that. It's not really a big deal, but it is a pain in the butt, because now your reel's all back together. You're going to have to disassemble it all the way to this point simply to flip that ratchet over. And it's kind of easy to do. I've done it myself on a number of occasions and smacked myself afterwards. So you just want to be aware of the correct direction that those teeth go in. If you have a right-handed reel, they are going to be going in a clockwise direction. If you have a left-handed reel, it's going to be reversed, and it's going to be going in a counterclockwise direction. But either way, make sure that you put it back on in the same orientation that you removed it on. So when you pick it up to clean it and you're moving it all in different directions while you're cleaning it, put it back the same way. So the next component we're going to remove is the pinion gear and the yoke. The pinion gear is this gold gear here that meshes with the main gear, And the yoke is this piece of white plastic here that sits on these two posts and then has the springs on the two posts. So we're going to remove the yoke springs off the yoke posts. And then in order to remove that gear, all you have to do is lift up on it and it will be attached to the yoke. So you have the yoke and the pinion gear. And now the pinion gear has a narrower side and a wider side. And that wider end of the pinion gear is the end that goes down into the shaft hole when it comes time for reassembly. Pinion gear also has a groove in the middle of it, and that's where it marries with the yoke, and it sits like that on top of the yoke posts. Next, we are going to remove the main gear shaft, gear, and bearing plate. This bearing plate is held in by two screws, and all you have to do is remove those screws. So I'll go ahead and take those out now. And now I can lift up the main gear shaft and the bearing plate. Now you may want to take a photograph here again so you can see the proper orientation of this bearing plate, so you don't end up trying to put it on in reverse like this and it ends up being incorrect. You'll notice here that it has an appendage on this side that is curved, and so it kind of goes around this molding of the housing here. So you want to just take that out. And now you can break this down into the individual components of the gear shaft, the gear, the bearing plate, but you don't have to. You can clean this effectively by keeping it together, and I always like to take things apart as least as possible in order to achieve the goal. So I usually leave this assembly together as a whole. So we'll put that right over there. And now underneath the bearing plate is a bearing. And we'll put that bearing right with the component that it goes with. So now we don't have to tear down these components any further. You'll see that there's quite a few components still left in here that you can break down. But again, you don't really need to in order to achieve an effective cleaning and lubrication. If you want to break those down, God bless you. But this is as far as I go on routine maintenance and cleaning. So now we're going to turn our attention to the assemblies of the front of the reel. And what you're going to have here is the worm drive assembly and the level wind guide assembly. And those are both behind this hood here. So in order to access those components, we're going to remove the hood, which is secured with a screw on this side and a screw on this side. So I'll remove those screws. Once you have those screws removed, you can simply wiggle that hood off. I'm going to put that right there with the screws that go with it. And now that we have that hood removed, you get a little bit better view of the worm drive assembly and the level wind guide. Now it's important to break these components down when you're cleaning, because pretty much those are about the parts that get the dirtiest in your reel. And the reason is because any kind of foreign objects or gunk on your line goes through your line guide, and a lot of times that just peels off there, and when you clean this, sometimes you'll find grass or weeds or dirt or mud or all kinds of stuff in these components here. So you definitely want to break these down so you can clean them and lubricate them properly when it's time for your maintenance. Now when it comes to these assemblies, they are all held together by an E-clip on the palm side of the reel here. And you'll see that E-clip, and underneath that will be a spacer, and then underneath that is this white plastic bushing. On the gear side of the reel, the handle side of the reel, you have the worm gear, and that's held in place by a pin that goes through the end of the worm drive itself. Now the first thing I'm going to remove after I remove that hood is the pillar. And what the pillar does is it goes through the housing, through the level wind guide, and then into the other side of the housing. And the reason I'm going to remove that first is because you see the end of it here. that is held in place by the hood. So when you remove that hood, that can fall out and you may not know where it came from. So you can see it wants to fall out there. So I'm just going to help it along and guide it out of the hole. Now when it comes to this pillar, you're going to see it has a nub on the end of it, and that nub is a smaller diameter than the rest of the shaft here. And the reason for that is because it goes in this way. It only goes in one way, and then that nub seats into the hole on this side. And so if you try to put this in this way, it won't go in because the hole on this side is only big enough to accommodate the small nub, whereas the hole on this side can accommodate the entire diameter of this rod. So this only goes in one way, and it goes through the handle side of the reel when it comes time for reassembly. So I'm going to lay that pillar down, and now I'm going to begin to disassemble the worm drive and the level wind guide. And to do that, we're going to begin with the E-clip that holds it all together. And you'll see that the E-clip has a couple of notches in it. And if you get a very small slotted screwdriver, you can just stick a tip of that in one of those notches and then pop it off. However, you want to be cognizant of covering it. You want to cover your hand over that when you pop it off, because an E-clip is held on there by spring tension. When you release that spring tension and pop it off, that clip sometimes wants to go across the room on you. And if it does, good luck finding it. So I'm going to put my screwdriver tip down in one of those notches. I'm going to cover it with my hand. I'm going to pop it off. And we should find it. It bounced off my hand and went down into the reel housing. And so we have the E-clip. Now underneath that E-clip is going to be a spacer and that bushing I talked about. And so we'll pop those out. So we have the spacer and the bushing. And now that that end is disassembled, that leaves the other end free to move. So now I'm going to turn my attention over to the other side of the worm drive. And since it moves now, I can kind of push that worm gear down and access the little pin that goes through there. So I'm going to go ahead and poke that pin through. Which allows me to remove the worm gear. Now in the worm gear, you'll notice that it has two notches in the shape of a cross, and that is where that pin goes into one of those notches. It doesn't matter which one, but that pin seats into those notches when you reassemble this. Now I'm still not going to be able to remove this worm drive yet because the level wind guide is still attached to it here. So the way we detach that is by taking off this nut here. And you should be able to remove that by hand, but if not, it has a slot for a slotted screwdriver. And so I'm simply going to remove that level wind guide nut and put that aside. Now underneath that nut is going to be a piece of metal called the pawl. And the pawl is what engages the level wind guide to the worm drive. You remove that simply by gravity. All you have to do is pop that out into your hand. And you will see that at the end of it, it has these ears or appendages, and those go down into the grooves on the worm drive, and that's what allows it to move across. It allows the level wind guide to move back and forth across the worm drive. That's how the reel evenly distributes your line across the face of your spool. So by moving back and forth, when you're cranking your handle, the line is being wound, but it's moving, so it's going across the entire face of your spool. If that were fixed, it would only go on one spot on your spool, so that wouldn't work. So now that I have that pawl out, the level wind guide is disengaged, so I can separate it from the worm drive. So here you'll see the level wind guide, and you'll see that it has the hole here that accommodates the pillar, And then it has the bigger hole here that accommodates the worm drive tube and the worm drive. And then from the front view, you have the lower hole, which is where the pawl goes in and then the cap goes on. And the upper hole is your line guide, and that's where your line goes in and out off of your spool. And so now that I have that gear off, the worm gear, I can take this little plastic bearing off here. Typically that's a ball bearing, but it's a plastic type, washer type bearing on this reel. And so now I can remove the worm drive from the worm drive tube. When I remove the worm drive, you'll see that one end of it has the hole, and that hole is what that pin goes through in order to seat into the worm drive, rather the worm gear. So you're going to want to remember that it goes in that way, and that hole is going to have to be on the gear side or the handle side of the reel, because that's where the gear is. So we have the pillar, the worm drive, and the worm drive tube. And a note on the worm drive tube is that can only go in one way in order to put this together effectively and properly. And that is with the cup. Okay, it's got a cupped end, and it's got a with a lip on it, and it's got a non-lipped end. That lipped end goes on the gear side or the handle side, because that's what this bearing and that gear sit on top of. So that's one way to remember which way it goes in properly. That's as far as we're going to break down this reel. You can certainly break it down farther. There are a whole lot more parts in the handle side plate, in the handle, in the palm side plate, in the spool, and in the remainder of the housing here. But again, you don't need to break it down any further than this to achieve a good solid cleaning for regular routine maintenance. And also, as you can see, this is the reason that you want to work on a movable surface. If you had all these small components laid out on your dining room table or something, you had to go away. If you've got kids or pets or any other kind of ankle biters in your house, guarantee they're going to get at this stuff, and you're going to be mad because you're going to come back and something's going to be missing. So, movable work surface. Now at this point, I would methodically clean each and every part of the reel that I have broken down here, and then I would lubricate by oiling the bearings and greasing the gears. But again, this reel hasn't been used, so there's really no dirt in it. So I'm just going to skip the cleaning part for this, and we're going to go right to the reassembly. So on reassembly, we're basically, for the most part, going to go in reverse order of what we did on disassembly. How I'm going to start is by taking the worm drive tube, and remember the cupped end that holds the bearing is going to be on the handle side of the reel. And I'm going to take the level wind guide, and once I put the worm drive tube halfway through, I'm going to put it through the big hole in the level wind guide. And then the other end of the worm drive tube seats into the corresponding hole on the other side of the housing. Now the next thing I'm going to do is insert the worm drive, and now remember the end with the hole that pin goes in is going to be on the gear side or the handle side. So we're going to make sure that we stick this through so that the hole end, the end with the hole, is sticking out of the gear side of the reel. And so now I'm going to place my finger here so the worm gear doesn't fall out, that worm drive rather. And I'm going to go ahead and assemble the gear side of the worm drive assembly. That is to say, I'm going to put this plastic bushing bearing type thing right over it. Then I'm going to take the worm gear, which has the cross-section grooves on it, and put that on with those grooves facing up. Then I'm going to push the worm drive out enough where that hole is visible, so I can take that little pin, put that right in the hole, and so I just got that through there, and so I'm just going to manipulate it with my hand to get that pin flush down in. And so now you can see when it's flush into that groove, you have it in the correct position. And so we're going to move over to the palm side of the reel, and we're going to replace that bushing. And that bushing has a little rectangular nub on it here, and that fits right in a molded piece of the housing here, so you really can't put that in incorrectly. Then I'm going to replace the spacer over the bushing, and that should leave just enough room for the E-clip. And I'm going to put that E-clip in position, as you can see there. So I got it in position for me to pop it on. I'm going to take again my small slotted screwdriver and put it on the end of it to get some leverage. Then I'm going to cover it with my hand again to make sure it doesn't go flying, and pop it on. And so you can see there the E-clip is on, and so now that worm drive is secured on both sides. Now we have to secure the level wind guide to the worm drive, and we do that by installing the pawl. And remember, you put that with those ears going down, and that's going to go right down in there. And if it sticks up above the edge of the pocket that it goes in, all you have to do is move it across the worm drive, and those ears are going to make it fall down into the grooves. And then once it's flush or a little bit below the top of that pocket there, we can go ahead and replace the nut. And now this nut is plastic. You don't want to over tighten it. All you got to do is hand tighten it and snug it. And now once that's secure, we can go ahead and take the pillar. And now remember, the pillar only goes in one way, and it has that nub on the end of it. So we're going to go through the handle side hole, through the corresponding hole on that level wind guide, and then out to the other side, and we're going to guide it into the hole that the nub fits in. You may have to manipulate that with your hand a little bit to get it right in the hole, but you want to make sure it goes in there. And you'll know when you have it correctly because it will be flush here. And so if it's sticking out, you know it's not seated properly, but if it's flush, you know it's correct. Now that I have that in, I want to be careful not to tip it the way that that rod will come out. Remember that this hood is what keeps that into position with the side of it. So we're going to replace the hood now. And just kind of pop that into place. And now that that hood is in place, we don't have to worry about the pillar falling out. So now I'm going to take the screws for the hood and replace those. So now we've completed the reassembly of the worm drive assembly, the level wind guide assembly, and the hood. And we can turn our attention back to the handle side or the gear side of the reel. The first thing we're going to do there is replace the bearing that goes in the pocket underneath the bearing plate. And this is already sufficiently oiled, but I'll just put another drop of oil on that bearing there. And then we're going to replace the main gear shaft and the bearing plate. And now remember, you want to put this back with the appropriate orientation. It sits right in there like that. And then remember, that curved piece goes around this shaft hole here. And that will line up the two screw holes, and the two gears will mesh so they will interact together. So now we'll take the two screws for that and replace those. Okay, now that we have that in place, we're going to go ahead and replace the pinion gear and the yoke. Now remember, the wider side of the pinion gear goes down in the hole, and the groove in the middle is what mates with the yoke, and the two holes on the yoke go over the yoke posts. And so that just drops in like so. And when it's down flush, it will have enough post left over for you to put the springs back on the posts. So now the yoke springs are in place. And we can replace the ratchet and the drag washers in the main gear. So the ratchet comes first, and you'll see that the middle of it is keyed in that rectangular shape, so it sits on the very base of the main gear shaft. And we'll get that right down there. And now the teeth are in the right way to engage with the kick lever there. Now the carbon fiber washer, the main gear, and you're going to get that down so it's all the way down and it is interacting with the pinion gear. The next washer and the top drag washer. So now that we have that in place, we're going to replace the sleeve. Now remember, the sleeve has the circular end and the end with the two straight sides on it. The circular end goes down. And then I'm going to take the sleeve washer, return that to its position. Now I can put the handle side plate back on. Now remember, the rod for the release of the palm side plate goes through this hole here. So we're going to lower that handle side plate down, and there's going to be a little bit of resistance from the springs on the yoke post there. So then we'll hold it together while we replace the screws. Okay, now we have the handle side plate replaced, and we can go ahead and replace the washers. And we're going to have the curved washers here, and remember the orientation of those. These are called spring washers. Then we have this thicker washer. Next is the star drag. Now putting on the star drag is simply a matter of screwing it on, but sometimes it can be a little tough getting that first thread on there. So you want to make sure that it spins freely like that. And then when you get down here, you can go ahead and hold the main gear shaft so you can spin it down the rest of the way, because when you get to a certain point, it's going to want to spin the gear shaft with it. Now after we have the star drag, we have the handle washer. In this case, it's like a handle clip. And then the handle. Once the handle is on, we can replace the handle nut. Now when you tighten down that handle nut with your 10mm wrench, you don't want to over tighten it, you just want to make it snug. And then you can take your handle nut retainer, which goes over the handle nut, and now you're going to want to line up this hole in the retainer with the hole in the handle. And a lot of times, based on the position of the nut, you can't get that exactly lined up right away. So all you have to do is take it off and tweak that nut a little bit with your wrench so that can get lined up, or reposition the retainer. And in this case, I'll just move this a little to the left, and that should line up fine now. So now we're going to take the handle retainer screw, and we'll insert that. And so now we're all set on the handle side of the reel. So we'll go ahead and replace the spool on the palm side, and the spool has bearings on it, and so I would oil those if I was lubricating this, but it's already done. And then once that spool is in, our last component is the palm side plate, which also has a bearing which needs oiling, and that is for the external brake dial on this style of reel. And so all we're going to do is Put that in place, rotate it down, and that spring rod will engage it, and it's all set. So you're good to go on your American Hero lues. Smooth, clean, quiet, ready to go, like new. I hope this video was a help to you if you own this type of reel. Do this a few times and you'll be proficient at doing your own reel maintenance. Hey, thanks for being a part of Chicken Thigh Fishing, and we'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay fishing, my friends.